He went back into the house. He was not seen again. 3 months later, another crowd gathered outside, kneeling in S Street, because in the third floor bedroom, Woodrow Wilson was dying. He died in February 1924. His last word was Edith. And ever since, there's been a debate raging about Woodrow Wilson and his legacy. Is the war in Iraq part of Woodrow Wilson's legacy? Is the notion that the United States has an almost divine mission, not only to civilize the world, but to democratize the world? Are we, in fact, a missionary nation? Is that Wilson's legacy? But also the notion of collective security, of the world coming together and talking out its differences in the League of Nations, what the United Nations was supposed to be and sometimes is. That's part of the Wilson legacy. In any event, Wilson has been gone for 80 years, but I can't think of another president, including Lincoln, including Washington, of whom it could be said 80 years after his death that he still lives, that he still influences policymakers for better or worse, and that he's still being debated about. Questions, comments, observations? We've got a microphone right there.
Would you speak to the issue of the last 18 months in the White House and who was running our government under Wilson's?
I'm having trouble hearing you, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Would you speak to the issue of who was running the White House during the
It wasn't
last
Mrs.
18
Wilson.
months?
Now, this is, there's an old story that Edith Wilson is the first woman president of the United States. I would say it would be more accurate to say Edith Wilson was the first White House chief of staff in American history. Her husband had a stroke in October 1919. He didn't leave office until March 1921. In retrospect, his reputation would be much stronger if he had resigned. And then he would have been a martyr to the cause. Instead, he lingered on. The White House lied about his condition. They pretended that he was, in fact, in better health than he was. They sustained the lie. The press went along with the lie. Although gossip, there was inevitably gossip. For example, when Teddy Roosevelt's rambunctious children, had the run of the White House, they had actually installed iron bars on second floor windows to make sure they didn't fall out. Well, guess what? No one noticed them until Wilson was up there lying on his sickbed. And it was suggested, actually it was gossip, that the reason the iron bars were placed there was because the president was insane and they had to keep him from jumping out the window. So all of this gossip is going on. The White House is basically lying about the president's condition. And in between is Mrs. Wilson. Now, Mrs. Wilson has no desire to be president of the United States. She's not educated for the role. She's really not very politically sophisticated. She has one thing and one thing only. She wants her husband to live. And so what she did was she controlled access to the president. She controlled access to his sick room. She controlled which paperwork went in and out of the. Now that's a very powerful role, but it's not the same as being president. It's more like being chief of staff. She wasn't making decisions about policy. She was making decisions about what issues the president would decide. And as his health slowly, very gradually, sort of marginally began to improve, that slacked off. But it's an urban legend that has lived on all of these years that Edith Wilson was the first female president. Not so. Yeah.
He was an advisor to Wilson. Colonel E. Mandel House.
Right.
He was Wilson's alter ego.
Yes.
And he had an agenda, Colonel E. Mandel's House did. He wrote in a book, Philip Drew Administrator.
Yes. Yeah.
And he projected a new world order
yes.
of internationalism and out of which I assume the United Nations, all these things were projected from. Who was this individual, Colonel E. Mandel House, whom George Varick says these money men put their confidence in Colonel E. Mandel House, and he was around the world actually creating a lot of problems. Could you go on?
Yeah, let me tell you very briefly. Presidents, you could do a book about presidents' best friends. Colonel House was a little diminutive Texan. The title colonel was purely honorary, bestowed on him by political friends, who had his own passion for governing. But Colonel House knew that he could never run for office. He could never win office. He didn't have the temperament. He didn't have the appearance. He didn't have the gifts. What he had a gift for, a genius for, was behind-the-scenes manipulation and what you and I would call strategic planning. Okay. He became very good friends with Woodrow Wilson. He became Wilson's right hand in many ways. And it was a very constructive relationship until they got to Versailles after World War I. Wilson actually sent Colonel House over before he went himself. He had such confidence in House that he trusted House to, in effect, carry on the negotiations until the president got there. But remember, by this time, Wilson's health was deteriorating rapidly. We know he suffered from a severe case of flu. Now, the flu in 1919 is not the flu in 2006. After World War I, there was a worldwide epidemic of influenza, which killed more people than World War I killed. It was an absolutely devastating disease, not like the flu as you and I know it today. We know that Wilson had a severe case of the flu in Versailles. We also know he began acting very strangely. He became quite paranoid. He would order furniture rearranged in the middle of the night for no reason. There is some suspicion that, in fact, he may have suffered another minor stroke at Versailles, and that affected his reasoning. And that, in turn, led to this break that he had with Colonel House. In the middle of the Versailles Conference, he decided that House had betrayed him, that he could no longer be trusted. Now, it gets even more soap opera-ish because the second Mrs. Wilson didn't like Colonel House. She resented him, he resented her. It's an old story. You don't have to be President of the United States to have such fissures in your household. But in any event, Mrs. Wilson was only too glad to get rid of Colonel House. He became a non-person, and in fact, he wasn't even invited to Wilson's funeral when he died. So he is one of those amazing sort of sidebars to American history. You know, when you hear about how powerful a president is, again, that power may be exaggerated in theory, but it's also shared and in some ways dispersed and diluted through others. Colonel House is a good example. He was the closest thing to an assistant president that we've ever had.